The story of Godwyn the Golden is the story of an era's sunset, a tragedy that began not with a scream, but with a silent puncture in the fabric of reality. To understand the birth of Deathroot, one must first understand the height from which the world fell. Before the Night of the Knives, Godwyn was the living heartbeat of the Golden Order. He was the firstborn of Queen Marica and Godfrey, a demigod of such immense and rhythmic grace that his very presence felt like a steady vibration of the absolute and warm protection of the sun. The air around him was always a shimmering, pressurized weight that smelled of blooming flowers, polished gold, and the sweet, heavy scent of a summer that was never meant to end. The history of Godwyn's rise is defined by his victory over the ancient dragons. In the lore of the early Erdtree, the war between the dragons and the gold was a conflict of monumental scale. While the rest of the world saw the dragons as jagged, cold remnants of a dead age, Godwyn saw a rhythmic and sharp nobility in them. After defeating the great dragon Fortisax, Godwyn did not execute him. Instead, he offered friendship, birthing the ancient dragon cult within the walls of Leyndell. This was the peak of the unalloyed gold era, a time when the red gold of the Crucible and the yellow gold of the Erdtree lived in a shallow and rhythmic harmony. The atmosphere of the capital was a suffocating pressure of prosperity, where the dragon's lightning turned from the red of destruction to the gold of the divine. The investigation into the soul of Godwyn reveals a figure who was the bridge between the old world and the new. He was the master of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, but he moved with the steady rhythm of a person who believed that the order of the world was permanent. The traveler moving through the memories of this era encounters a city of white stone and gold leaf, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the ornamental shields. This was the age of plenty, where the Erdtree's sap flowed freely, and the concept of death was a distant, forbidden memory. Every movement of the prince was a thud that echoed the stability of the throne, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the Golden Order was the only truth. The struggle for the future of the land moved with a relentless and cold energy. But in Godwyn's time, it was an energy of construction rather than destruction. He oversaw the building of the great cathedrals, where the light of the sun was captured in stained glass, filling the silent spaces of the heart with a steady and heavy rhythm of worship. The atmosphere of the world was a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic of the fingers. They found that the propaganda of the era was not a lie of malice, but a lie of comfort, the belief that because Godwyn was eternal, the world would never know the cold again. The air in the heart of the palace was a cold flame as they looked at the Lord Vessel, realizing that the prince was the anchor that held the entire reality together. However, the shadows were already lengthening in the corners of the golden glades. While Godwyn represented the absolute and cold perfection of the light, the very fact of his immortality was a shallow and rhythmic vibration of a world that had stopped moving. The lore shows that the age of the Erdtree was a state of stagnant grace, where the refusal to let anything die had created a spiritual tension that was waiting for a single point of failure. The air in the deep places of the world began to feel weighted with the presence of the coming night, a sight that carried the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the black flame. They checked the grip on their weapon in the silence of the evening, the metal clicking with a rhythmic and grounding force as the first whispers of the conspiracy reached the ears of those who lived in the dark. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was watching a sun set for the last time. They saw the golden light of the prince shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the royal banquet, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the night when the first drop of royal blood would touch the soil. The light of the Golden Prince was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the peace that was about to be turned into a nightmare of roots. The path toward the fall of the House of Gold had begun. The transition from the era of life to the era of the half-dead was a single heartbeat away, and the first root of the Deathroot was already waiting to grow from the prince's heart. The shadow of the coming tragedy did not originate in the lands between, but in the cold, lunar silence of the Carrion royal bloodline. To understand how the Golden Prince fell, one must look to the lunar princess Rani and her rejection of the two fingers. The air surrounding this conspiracy was a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of frozen starlight, dark water, and the sharp, metallic scent of cold-forged silver. Rani, a candidate for the succession of America, felt the absolute and cold, suffocating pressure of a destiny she did not choose. Her history is one of a rhythmic and quiet rebellion, a desire to sever the golden threads of the greater, while that bound her spirit to a fleshly vessel. The theft of the rune of death was the first rhythmic and sharp strike against the foundational laws of the world. On a night when the fog lay thick over the mountaintops of the giants, Rani's agents, the Black Knife Assassins, infiltrated the forbidden sanctum where Malekith guarded the rune. The atmosphere of that heist was a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and cold focus required to touch the essence of the end. They did not take the entire rune. Instead, they carved a fragment from it, a rhythmic and sharp shard of destined death that they used to imbue their daggers with a power that could slay the eternal. This was the birth of the Black Knives, weapons that carried the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, bitter tang of the charcoal black flame. The investigation into the movement of the assassins reveals a group of Newman women who shared a mysterious and rhythmic bond with Queen Marika herself. They moved through the outskirts of Lanedell, with the steady rhythm of predators who were invisible to the golden light. The traveler moving through the hidden trails of the Altus Plateau encounters the lingering traces of their presence. The air carries a faint scent of the ozone and the metallic grit of the dark magic. These women were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, but they carried their mission with a rhythmic and cold discipline that allowed them to pass through the city's defenses like smoke through a screen. The struggle to protect Godwyn was a roar of movement that never happened, as the guards were blinded by the very grace they worshipped. The conspiracy moved with a relentless and cold energy, fueled by Rani's desire to perish in body alone, so her soul could be free of the finger's influence. To achieve this, she needed a simultaneous death, a rhythmic and sharp balance of the cosmic scales. While she would slay her own Empyrean flesh, another demigod had to perish in soul. Godwyn the Golden, the pinnacle of the Erdtree's vitality, was the chosen sacrifice. The atmosphere of the plot was a suffocating pressure of the inevitable, where the rhythmic and heavy pulse of the coming night began to drown out the golden hum of the capital. Every ritualistic preparation was a thud that shook the hidden foundations of the world, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the miracle of the peace was about to be burned away. The lore shows that the assassins were not mere mercenaries. They were the executors of a new and rhythmic reality. They found that the propaganda of the eternal kingdom had made the demigods arrogant, leaving the palace halls unguarded against a threat that bypassed the physical. The air in the heart of the conspiracy was a cold flame as they looked at the map of the palace, tracing the path to the prince's chambers. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of a tree from the inside, their movements a blur of the dark mail and the silver blades. The light of the moon provided the guide, a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of their minds as they prepared for the moment that would turn the prince's golden blood into a source of universal rot. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was watching a storm cloud roll over a summer field. They saw the golden light of the palace shrinking in the distance of their intent. The air there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the royal capital under the cover of the lunar eclipse, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the prince's bedside. The light of the stolen rune was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the betrayal that would birth the first Deathroot. The path toward the assassination was clear. The transition from the era of prosperity to the era of the soulless was only a few silent steps away, and the first drop of the poison was ready to fall. The silence of the royal chambers on the night of the assassination was not the peaceful rest of a kingdom at its zenith, but a heavy, pressurized vacuum. The air within the golden walls of Godwyn's sanctum was a suffocating weight that smelled of cold incense, guttering candles, and the sharp, sudden scent of ozone that precedes a terminal strike. Outside, the capital of Lanedell slept under the rhythmic hum of the Erdtree. But inside, the shadows had begun to detach themselves from the marble pillars. This was the moment the unalloyed gold of the lineage was met with the charcoal-black reality of destined death. The movement of the Black Knife assassins was a shallow and rhythmic vibration, a blur of silver mail and translucent blades that moved with the steady rhythm of a predator entering a fold. Godwyn the Golden, the firstborn and the pride of the Erdtree, was not taken in a grand duel of warriors. The history of his fall is a chronicle of a rhythmic and cold efficiency. The assassins did not strike with the roar of a battlefield, but with the silent, rhythmic focus of an execution. As the prince lay in a state of grace, the black knives converged, their daggers glowing with the stolen fragment of the rune of death. The atmosphere was a thick and humid pressure of the absolute and heavy betrayal. Every step they took was a thud that echoed the coming end of the Golden Age. A rhythmic and sharp reminder that the greater will's protection did not extend into the realm of the soul. Once the laws of death had been reintroduced, the investigation into the strike reveals a horrific metaphysical precision. To fulfill Ranni's plot, the assassins had to carve the curse mark of death into Godwyn's flesh. The traveler moves through the mental echoes of that room where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the black and white fire. This was a conflict of monumental consequence, where the rhythmic and heavy pulse of the golden blood was interrupted by the jagged, cold energy of the rune. As the blades pierced his skin, the gold of his eyes did not dim, it curdled. This was the birth of a new and terrifying state of being, a death that was incomplete. The prince was slain in soul, while his body, the vessel of the Erdtree's vitality, remained stubbornly, rhythmically alive. The struggle for the prince's life moved with a relentless and cold energy in the seconds following the strike. The atmosphere of the chamber turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. The assassins did not linger to celebrate. They vanished back into the night, leaving behind a world that had been fundamentally broken. The scream that finally tore through the palace was not from Godwyn, but from the reality of the Golden Order itself, as it realized that its foundation had been pulled away. Every pulse of the Erdtree from that moment on was a thud that shook the hearts of the people, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the eternal Queen's firstborn was now a hollowed-out husk of divine meat. The lore shows that this half-death was the catalyst for the ultimate corruption of the land. Because Godwyn died only in soul, the Erdtree did not know how to process his remains. The atmosphere of the capital became a heavy pressure of the stagnant grief, where the air was a shallow and rhythmic gasp of the white mist. They found that the propaganda of the perfect death was a lie that had ended in a spiritual stalemate. The Prince of Gold was now the Prince of Death, a rhythmic and cold vibration that would soon begin to leak into the roots of the world. The air in the heart of the palace was a cold flame as they looked at the body of the prince, realizing that the goddess Marika was now staring into a void that no amount of gold could fill. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was watching a beautiful tapestry being unraveled by a single loose thread. They saw the golden light of Godwyn's glory shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the funeral procession, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the roots where the prince would be interred. The light of the Golden Prince was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the tragedy that would eventually sprout into the first tendril of the Deathroot. The path toward the burial was set. The transition from the living prince to the source of the rot was beginning, and the roots of the Erd-tree were waiting to receive a guest they could never digest. The burial of Godwyn the Golden was not a return to the earth, but a violent injection of corruption into the very veins of the world. Marika, in her desperate grief and refusal to accept the finality of the black knife strike, ordered her son to be interred at the very base of the Erd-tree, deep within the root-facing cliffs. The air in these subterranean reaches was a thick, suffocating pressure that smelled of wet loam, ancient petrification, and the heavy, sweet scent of a body that refused to decay. This was the moment the great tree became a host for a parasitic nightmare. Instead of the Erd-tree absorbing the soul of the fallen demigod to be reborn through grace, it encountered a soulless vessel of infinite vitality that it could not digest. The history of the first sprouting is a chronicle of a rhythmic and cold biological horror. In the lore of the deep roots, the Erd-tree attempted to pull Godwyn's essence into its network, but because he was the Prince of Death, a being dead in soul, but alive in flesh, the process was inverted. The atmosphere of the root caverns was a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and heavy corruption. Every pulse of the Erd-tree's sap was met by a counterpulse from Godwyn's spreading influence. This was the birth of the first Deathroot, a jagged, thorny black growth that resembled a tangle of dried veins and centipede legs, spreading through the golden wood like a cancer. The investigation into the burial site reveals the physical transformation of the prince into something unrecognizable. The traveler moves through the deep-root depths where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the stagnant water. This was a time of monumental and quiet change, where the rhythmic and heavy thud of the water falling from the ceiling announced the arrival of the Prince of Death's throne. Godwyn's body did not stay human, it began to bloat and distort, his face stretching into a massive, clam-like visage with staring, empty eyes. His presence was a steady vibration of a life that had been stripped of its purpose, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that even the most sacred soil could be defiled by a broken law. The struggle for the integrity of the Erdtree moved with a relentless and cold energy as the Deathroot began to follow the path of the roots to every corner of the lands between. The atmosphere of the underground turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. Everywhere the roots touched, the Deathroot sprouted, breaking through the floors of catacombs and the walls of ancient ruins. Every new growth was a thud that shook the hearts of the Golden Order's priests, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the eternal kingdom was now literally rotting from the bottom up. The lore shows that this was not a natural decay, but a rhythmic and cold manifestation of the rune of death trying to reassert itself in a world that had forbidden it. The lore of the first dead shows that Godwyn had become a god of a different kind, a patron to those who had no place in the light. The atmosphere of the deep ruins was a heavy pressure of the lost potential, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the dusk. They found that the propaganda of the holy burial had backfired, creating a focal point for every soulless and forgotten thing in the world. The air in the heart of the roots was a cold flame as they looked at the spreading black thorns, realizing that Marika's attempt to preserve her son had instead created a weapon that would eventually consume her entire empire. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was watching a black ink drop spread through a glass of clear water. They saw the golden light of the upper world shrinking in the distance of the tunnels. The air there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the Deathroot depths, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to find those who would eventually worship the rot. The light of the golden tree was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the shadow that was now feeding on the blood of the old world. The path toward the spread of the infection was open. The transition from the buried prince to the source of Deathroot was complete, and the first, those who live in death, were beginning to stir in their graves. The transition from the birth of the first undead to the systematic persecution of the soulless was a descent into a world of institutionalized terror. As the Deathroot spread, the Golden Order realized that their eternal peace was being invaded by a rhythmic and cold mutation that they could neither understand nor cure. The air in the lands between became a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of incense, burning wood, and the sharp, metallic tang of the golden epitaph. This was the era of the Great Purge, led by the fundamentalist hunters of the dead. D, hunter of the dead, and his peers moved with a shallow and rhythmic grace, their mission to excise the black thorns from the flesh of the world. The history of the Golden Order fundamentalists is a chronicle of a logic that had turned into a weapon. In the lore of the early hunters, the existence of those who lived in death was not just a physical threat, but a rhythmic and sharp insult to the laws of the Earth Tree. The atmosphere of the capital's high councils was a suffocating pressure of absolute and heavy dogma. They believed that by perfecting the lithic understanding of the Elden Ring, they could find a formula to erase the Deathroot entirely. Every hunt they conducted was a thud that echoed the closing of the golden mind, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that in Marika's world, there was no room for anything that did not bow to the sun. The investigation into the early purges reveals a culture of monumental cruelty masked as holiness. The traveler moves through the village of the Albinorics and the outskirts of the Summon Waiter village, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the holy water. This was a time of rhythmic and cold execution, where the Golden Order hunters burned bodies with a shallow and rhythmic focus, hopping to prevent the roots from taking hold. The presence of the hunters was a steady vibration of the absolute and heavy intolerance of the law. They did not see the humanity in the skeletal eyes of their victims. They saw only a rhythmic and sharp error in the grand equation of the greater will. The struggle for the soul of the common people moved with a relentless and cold energy, as the fear of the Deathroot turned neighbors against one another. The atmosphere of the provincial towns turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot from the funeral pyres. They encountered the golden epitaph, a sword forged by Miquella the Unalloyed, intended to grant a true death to his brother Godwyn. This weapon was a rhythmic and sharp manifestation of the tragedy. Even the most compassionate demigods were forced to seek the destruction of what Godwyn had become. Every swing of the blade was a thud that shook the foundations of the family, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the Golden Order was a house divided against itself. However, the more the hunters struck at the branches of the Deathroot, the stronger the roots grew in the deep places. The lore tells of how the persecution only drove the worshippers of the prince further into the shadows, creating a rhythmic and cold underground network. The atmosphere of the secret shrines was a heavy pressure of the shared trauma, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the Prince of Gold. They found that the propaganda of the Holy Hunt had failed to address the source of the problem. The air in the heart of the capital was a cold flame, as the priests realized that the Deathroot was not just a parasite on the tree, but had become part of its very DNA. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was trying to wash a bloodstain out of a white silk robe. They saw the golden light of the hunters' torches shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the forbidden catacombs, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to meet the Fia deathbed companion. The light of the Golden Order was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the war that would eventually lead to the crowning of a dead lord. The path toward the final confrontation was being paved with the bones of the unwanted. The transition from the hunter to the hunted was nearly complete, and the prince's dream of a world of death was starting to take its final shape. The transition from the violent purges of the hunters to the quiet, intimate halls of the deathbed companions was a shift into a world of velvet shadows and desperate tenderness. As the Golden Order tightened its iron grip, a secret order of women from beyond the fog began to arrive in the lands between, led by the enigmatic Fia. The air in their chambers was a heavy, suffocating pressure that smelled of dried lavender, old lace, and the cold, metallic scent of the grave. These women did not seek to destroy those who lived in death. They sought to offer them a final, rhythmic, and cold sanctuary. Their mission was to gather the warmth of the living to rekindle the spirit of a dead lord, a concept that the Golden Order branded as the ultimate heresy. The history of the deathbed companions is a chronicle of a forbidden mercy. In the lore of their distant homeland, their role was a sacred one. By lying with the noble remains of a hero, they could transfer the life force of many to a single, chosen body. The atmosphere of their ritual was a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the absolute and heavy intimacy of the end. Fia, however, had a grander vision. She was a woman of absolute and quiet focus, who felt the call of Godwyn the Golden from beneath the roots. She believed that the Prince of Death was not a monster to be hunted, but a victim of a rhythmic and sharp injustice who deserved to be made whole. The investigation into Fia's presence in the Round Table hold reveals the subtle, rhythmic erosion of the Golden Order from within. The traveler moves through the creaking wooden hallways of the hold, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the blacksmith's anvil. This was a time of secret whispers and heavy steel, where Fia would offer her blessing to the tarnished, a rhythmic and sharp exchange of vitality that left her companions with a lingering sense of the cold. Her presence was a steady vibration of a different kind of power, one that did not rely on the blinding light of the Earth Tree, but on the quiet, rhythmic cycle of the blood and the soil. The struggle for the future of the soulless moved with a relentless and cold energy as Fia began to gather the hallowbrand of the prince. The atmosphere of her quest turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot from the battlefield. She encountered the fierce resistance of the hunters, leading to a rhythmic and sharp conflict that was fought in the shadows of the capital. Every piece of the shattered curse-mark she recovered was a thud that shook the hearts of the fingers, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the dead were beginning to organize. The lore shows that Fia's love for the dead was a rhythmic and cold rebellion against a goddess who had abandoned her own children to a state of eternal, soulless lingering. However, the path to Godwyn's side was blocked by the ancient guardians of the roots. The lore tells of how Fia eventually fled the capital to return to the Deathroot depths, seeking the Prince of Death's throne. The atmosphere of the deep caverns was a heavy pressure of the coming completion, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the gold. They found that the propaganda of the Holy Kingdom could not stop the pull of the grave. The air in the heart of the roots was a cold flame as Fia prepared to lay with the distorted corpse of the prince. Realizing that the only way to save those who lived in death was to give the Prince of Death a new, rhythmic, and cold life through a mending rune. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was weaving a burial shroud from threads of gold and shadow. They saw the golden light of the upper world shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the Deathroot sanctum, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the final embrace. The light of the Golden Prince was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the darkness that would eventually lead to the age of the Duskborn. The path toward the mending of the world was narrow and cold. The transition from the companion to the mother of a new order was nearly complete, and the final secret of the Deathroot was waiting to be revealed. The revelation of the curse-mark was a moment of metaphysical horror that redefined the tragedy of the golden lineage. To understand the true source of the Deathroot's power, one must look at the jagged geometry of the curse-mark of death. The air in the chambers where this secret was uncovered was a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of ozone, old blood, and the sharp, alkaline scent of petrified bone. It was discovered that on the night of the Black Knives, the rune of death was not simply used. It was split in a rhythmic and cold ritual of simultaneous sacrifice. The mark was carved into two bodies at once, the flesh of the lunar princess Rani and the soul of Godwyn the Golden. This created a shallow and rhythmic vibration of a world out of balance, where one died in spirit and the other died in body. The history of the half-wheel of the centipede is a chronicle of a cosmic error. In the lore of the scholars, the curse-mark was never meant to be separated. The atmosphere of the investigation was a suffocating pressure of absolute and heavy dread. Because the mark was split, Godwyn became the first dead of the demigods, a rhythmic and sharp anchor for a new, corrupted cycle. The Deathroot was not just a plant. It was the physical manifestation of Godwyn's soulless vitality trying to reclaim its missing half. Every branch of the black thorns was a rhythmic and sharp search for the rune of death that had been stolen and hidden away by Ranni. The investigation into the locations of the marks reveals the monumental distance between the two victims. The traveler moves through the divine tower of Liurnia, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the frozen silver. There, at the peak of the tower, lay the charred remains of Ranni's original Empyrean body, bearing the half-wheel of the mark. This was a place of rhythmic and cold silence, a steady vibration of a sacrifice made to escape the greater will. Meanwhile, deep beneath the capital, Godwyn's distorted flesh carried the other half, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the Prince of Gold was now half of a key to a door that should never have been opened. The struggle to reunite the two halves moved with a relentless and cold energy as the Fia-led conspiracy sought to merge the marks into a single, mending rune of the Death Prince. The atmosphere of the quest turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They encountered the spectral remnants of those who knew the truth, every whisper a thud that shook the hearts of the Golden Order's loyalists. The lore shows that as long as the marks remained separate, the Deathroot would continue to grow without end, a rhythmic and cold cancer that fed on the very idea of a perfect world. The air in the heart of the library was a cold flame as they realized that the eternal age was built on a foundation that had been rhythmically and sharply split in two. However, the reunion of the marks required a champion who could navigate the shadows of both the moon and the tree. The lore tells of how the Tarnished were drawn into this rhythmic and cold game of cosmic chess. The atmosphere of the Divine Tower was a heavy pressure of the transition, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the stars. They found that the propaganda of the one true Lord was being challenged by the reality of the two true deaths. The air in the heart of the tower was a cold flame as they looked at the burned body of the princess, realizing that Godwyn's suffering was the fuel for Ranni's freedom. A rhythmic and sharp irony that the Golden Order could never acknowledge. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces were made of bone and light. They saw the golden light of the capital shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the Carrion Study Hall, and the air of the lake grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the final grave. The light of the half-mark was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the tragedy that would eventually bring the two halves of death together. The path toward the mending was clear, but the price of the unity was a world that would forever be shrouded in the dusk. The transition from the split death to the unified law was nearly complete, and the Prince of Death was waiting for his crown. The descent back into the absolute and cold depths of the world was a journey through a nightmare of petrified history and weeping roots. As the Tarnished gathered the two halves of the Cursamark, the air in the Deathroot depths became a heavy, pressurized weight that smelled of stagnant water, ancient mold, and the sharp, electric scent of a dragon's dying breath. This was the site of the final ritual. Godwyn's body had grown into a monumental and rhythmic obscenity, a sprawling mass of gray-white flesh that had merged with the very foundations of the Erdtree. The sound of this place was a constant, low thrum of the earth itself, a rhythmic and sharp vibration of a life that had no soul to guide it. The history of the Lich Dragon Fortisax is the story of a friendship that transcended the boundaries of life and death. In the lore of the ancient dragons, Fortisax was the mightiest of his kin, a creature of absolute and rhythmic power who had once been Godwyn's closest ally. When the prince was slain, the dragon did not flee. He entered the body of his friend to fight a rhythmic and cold war against the corruption from within. The atmosphere of Godwyn's dream was a suffocating pressure of absolute and heavy grief. Fortisax had stayed too long in the darkness, and he too had been transformed into a creature of death. His golden lightning turned into the jagged, charcoal-black bolts of the necrotic storm. The investigation into the deathbed dream reveals the final, rhythmic struggle for Godwyn's remains. To claim the mending rune, the traveler had to enter the mind of the prince, a place where the air carried the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the ancient scales. This was a battle of monumental scale, a rhythmic and heavy clash between the champion of the living and the protector of the dead. Fortisax fought with a relentless energy, a blur of movement and sound that filled the silent spaces of the cavern. Every strike of his black lightning was a thud that shook the foundations of the dream, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the transition to the age of death was guarded by the strongest heart of the old world. The struggle within the dream moved with a relentless and cold energy as the dragon fought to preserve what little was left of his friend's dignity. The atmosphere of the battlefield turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They encountered the death lightning, a rhythmic and sharp manifestation of the dragon's corruption that could kill with a single touch. The lore shows that Fortisax was not an enemy of the Tarnished, but a rhythmic and cold, tragic figure, a guardian who had become the very thing he sought to prevent. Every roar he unleashed was a thud that echoed the sorrow of the Golden Age, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the bond between the dragon and the prince was the last pure thing in a world of rot. However, the defeat of the dragon was the only way to complete the mending rune. The lore tells of how, as Fortisax fell, the rhythmic and cold energy of his sacrifice was absorbed into the cursor marks held by Fia. The atmosphere of the chamber was a heavy pressure of the transition, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the gold. They found that the propaganda of the eternal battle had come to an end. Fia, laying with the prince for the final time, used the gathered vitality of the dragon and the tarnished to birth the mending rune of the Death Prince. The air in the heart of the roots was a cold flame as the rune materialized, a rhythmic and sharp sigil that would allow the dead to be part of the world's new order. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was closing the eyes of a giant. They saw the golden light of the upper world shrinking in the distance of the past. The air there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the prince's final rest, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the Elden throne. The light of the new rune was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the darkness that would eventually bring the age of the Duskborn to the lands between. The path toward the throne was open. The transition from the source of the Deathroot to the foundation of a new law was complete, and the world was waiting for a lord who was not afraid of the dark. The transition from the lightless depths of the roots back to the surface was a climb through a world already surrendering to a gray, rhythmic twilight. With the mending rune of the Death Prince held in hand, the air in the lands between began to lose its sharp, golden sting, replaced by a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of damp earth, cooling ash, and the quiet, heavy scent of a long-delayed rest. This was the final march toward the Elden throne. The sound of the world was no longer the triumphant fanfare of the Erdtree, but the steady, rhythmic thrum of the new rune, a heartbeat for a kingdom that would finally acknowledge the beauty of the end. The history of the age of the Duskborn is the chronicle of a world finding its lost shadow. In the lore of the Mending, the goal was not to destroy the Golden Order, but to rhythmically and sharply weave the concept of death back into the fabric of reality. The atmosphere of the final ascent was a suffocating pressure of absolute and heavy finality. For centuries, the people had lived in a shallow and rhythmic stagnation. Now, the presence of the mending rune acted as a steady vibration of the absolute and cold truth that all things must eventually pass. The propaganda of the past was being replaced by a rhythmic and sharp realization that to be eternal was to be a hollowed-out statue, and to die was to finally be human again. The investigation into the final barriers of Leyndell reveals a city that had become a monumental tomb even before the rune arrived. The traveler moves through the ash-covered streets where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the shattered golden statues. This was a time of rhythmic and cold reflection, where the rhythmic and heavy thud of the players' boots echoed in the silent spaces of the capital. The defenders of the old order, from the Erdtree avatars to the last of the Golden Order knights, fought with a desperate and shallow energy. Their movements, a rhythmic and sharp reminder of a law that no longer had a soul to uphold it. They were fighting for a sun that had already set. Their presence, a steady vibration of a past that refused to acknowledge its own decay. The struggle for the Elden Throne moved with a relentless and cold energy as the Tarnished breached the final sanctum of the Erdtree. The atmosphere of the throne room was a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot from the burning tree. They encountered the final remnants of the golden lineage, every clash of steel a thud that shook the hearts of the watching stars. The lore shows that the implementation of the Death Prince's rune was the only way to heal the golden fracture without simply repeating the mistakes of Marika. It was a rhythmic and cold surgery on the divine, a way to ensure that those who live in death were no longer outcasts, but a rhythmic and sharp part of the natural cycle once more. However, the birth of the Duskborn Age was also a moment of absolute and rhythmic sacrifice. The lore tells of how the sky itself began to change as the rune was set into the ring. The atmosphere of the world turned into a heavy pressure of the transition, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the Prince of Death. They found that the dusk was not a total darkness, but a gentle, rhythmic, and cold softening of the light. The air in the heart of the tree was a cold flame as the golden leaves began to fall, turning into a shallow and rhythmic carpet of gray ash. The age of the absolute and blinding light was over, replaced by a world that was comfortable with the rhythmic and sharp silence of the grave. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was finally laying down a heavy burden. They saw the golden light of the old world shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They sat upon the Elden Throne, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the long, rhythmic, and cold rain of the dusk. The light of the mending rune was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the peace that comes when the sun finally sets. The path toward the new world was open. The transition from the Prince of Death to the Lord of the Duskborn was complete, and the lands between were finally allowed to sleep. The transition from the crowning of the new Lord to the stabilization of the world was a shift into a landscape of muted silver and persistent, rhythmic fog. As the age of the Duskborn settled over the lands between, the air lost its aggressive, golden heat, becoming a heavy and cool pressure that smelled of damp stone, ancient bark, and the sharp, crystalline scent of the morning dew. The legacy of the Deathroot was no longer a spreading cancer. It had become the new foundation. The black thorns that once pierced the earth with a violent energy now sat in a state of rhythmic and cold equilibrium. Their presence, a steady vibration of the law that had finally accepted the soulless as its own. The history of the post-shattering landscape under the Duskborn law is a chronicle of a world learning to breathe in the dark. In the lore of this new era, the undead were no longer hunted. They were integrated into the rhythmic and sharp cycle of the land. The atmosphere of the great catacombs was a suffocating pressure of a peace that had been absent for centuries. The spirits of the fallen, once trapped in a shallow and rhythmic loop of stagnation, were now permitted to return to the roots of the tree without the fear of the golden rejection. Every pulse of the modified Elden Ring was a thud that echoed the quietude of a cemetery, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the era of the frantic, eternal life had been replaced by a dignified, eternal rest. The investigation into the remains of the demigods reveals a world that had moved beyond the petty ambitions of the Shardbearers. The traveler moves through the ruins of the Haligtree and the Carrion Manor, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the abandoned silver. This was a time of monumental and quiet reflection, where the rhythmic and heavy thud of the wind through the hollow towers was the only sound. The surviving demigods, those who had not fallen to the tarnished, retreated into a rhythmic and cold isolation. Their presence was no longer a steady vibration of the divine power, but a shallow and rhythmic reminder of a failed experiment. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, but in the age of the Duskborn, they were merely ghosts of a golden past. The struggle for the restoration of the environment moved with a relentless and cold energy as the influence of the Deathroot began to purify the lands once choked by the scarlet rot. The atmosphere of the Caelid wilds turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. The black roots of Godwyn, empowered by the mending rune, acted as a rhythmic and sharp filter, drawing the toxins of the rot into the earth to be processed by the ancient tree. Every new sprout of the gray-leaved plants was a thud that shook the hearts of the survivors, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the world was finally healing, albeit in a form that was unrecognizable to those who remembered the age of Godfrey. However, the peace of the Duskborn was not a world without conflict. The lore tells of the last fundamentalists, those who still clung to the rhythmic and cold logic of the total gold. The atmosphere of the hidden mountain shrines was a heavy pressure of the lingering resentment, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the sun. They found that the propaganda of the old order was hard to kill, even in a world where the sun had turned to a pale, rhythmic disk. The air in the heart of the mountains was a cold flame as they looked at the burning icons of the Erdtree, realizing that even the most perfect peace carries the seeds of a rhythmic and sharp rebellion. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was closing the gates of a city for the winter. They saw the golden light of the old history shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the Elden throne room, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to watch the first nightfall of the new world. The light of the Duskborn was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the silence that would eventually become the only history left. The path toward the end of the history was nearly at its close. The transition from the War of the Shards to the Peace of the Grave was complete, and the memory of Godwyn the Golden was finally at peace with the reality of the Deathroot. The transition from the established reign of the Duskborn to the quiet fatting of the old institutions was a period of absolute and rhythmic dissolution. As the new law took root, the entities that had defined the era of the shattering began to lose their purpose, their presence turning into a thin, pressurized weight that smelled of old wood, cold hearths, and the sharp, metallic tang of rusted iron. This was the end of the Round Table hold. The air within the pocket dimension was a suffocating pressure of the age of the waiting, finally coming to a close. The sound of this time was the rhythmic, hollow echo of footsteps on floorboards that no longer led to glory, but to a shallow and rhythmic acceptance of a world that no longer needed heroes. The history of the Hold's final days is a chronicle of a fire finally burning out. In the lore of the Tarnished, the sanctuary was a place of absolute and quiet focus, but with the crowning of the Lord of the Duskborn, the guidance of grace became a dim, rhythmic flicker. The atmosphere of the central hall was a heavy pressure of the transition, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the cooling rain. Hugh, the master of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, continued to strike his anvil with a rhythmic and sharp energy, but his eyes were now a blur of the movement and the sound of a memory. He had forged a weapon to slay a god, and in the silence of the new age, his steady vibration of purpose turned into a shallow and rhythmic peace. The investigation into the fate of Fia reveals the moment the deathbed companion became the mother of the new cycle. The traveler moves through the Deathroot depths, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the stagnant water. This was a place of monumental and quiet completion. Having birthed the mending rune, Fia's spirit moved with a rhythmic and haunting grace into the roots herself. Her presence was no longer a steady vibration of a secret rebellion, but a rhythmic and sharp anchor for the millions who lived in death. She did not leave behind a corpse of decay, but a rhythmic and cold monuments of the first true death a shallow and rhythmic reminder that her love had finally mended the world. The struggle to let go of the old war moved with a relentless and cold energy as the spirits of the Round Table finally departed. The atmosphere of the hold turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot from the dying forge. They encountered the empty chairs of the great warriors, Gideon the all-knowing, Nephili Lu, and the others, every silence a thud that shook the hearts of the survivors. The lore shows that the hold was never a physical place, but a rhythmic and cold manifestation of a collective dream. As the dream ended, the air in the heart of the sanctuary was a cold flame. Realizing that the transition from the tarnished to the Lord was a rhythmic and sharp departure from everything they had once known. However, the dissolution of the hold was necessary for the world to move forward. The lore tells of how the age of the Duskborn required the abandonment of the old hierarchies. The atmosphere of the lands between was a heavy pressure of the new reality, where the air was a shallow and rhythmic gasp of the white mist. They found that the propaganda of the eternal hold was a lie that had served its purpose. The air in the heart of the capital was a cold flame as they looked at the burning embers of the past, realizing that to truly rule the dusk, one had to let the golden morning die completely. Every strike of the smith's hammer had been a rhythmic and sharp preparation for this silence. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was walking out of a house and closing the door behind them for the last time. They saw the golden light of the Round Table hold shrinking in the distance of the past. The air there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the world, and the air of the past grew distant as they prepared for the journey to exist in the world they had made. The light of the Duskborn was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the peace that comes when the fire finally goes out. The path toward the conclusion of the Godwyn legacy was reaching its peak. The transition from the hero to the myth was nearly complete, and the world was finally ready to forget the name of the Golden Prince. The transition from the era of individual heroics to a new, universal culture of the grave was a shift into a world of rhythmic and cold solemnity. As the age of the Duskborn matured, the very way the inhabitants of the lands between perceived their end underwent a monumental transformation. The air in the provincial graveyards and the sprawling catacombs became a thick, pressurized weight that smelled of freshly turned earth, silver-tinged incense, and the sharp, metallic scent of the Prince of Death's gaze. This was the birth of the new burial rites. No longer was death a shameful exclusion from the Erdtree's grace. It was now a rhythmic and sharp homecoming. A shallow and rhythmic acceptance of the body's return to the roots that had been purified by Godwyn's sacrifice. The history of the Dusk Priests is a chronicle of a society learning to find beauty in the shadow. In the lore of the post-Duskborn world, the role of the priest moved with a rhythmic and quiet focus, focusing on the preservation of the soulless rather than their destruction. The atmosphere of the new cathedrals was a suffocating pressure of absolute and heavy peace. They did not pray for a return to the light. They prayed for a steady vibration of the absolute and cold rest that Godwyn had pioneered. Every funeral was a thud that echoed the stability of the new order, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the cycle of life and death had been rhythmically and sharply mended. The investigation into the cultural shift reveals a world that had abandoned the unalloyed gold for a more rhythmic and complex silver. The traveler moves through the village centers, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the commemorative statues. This was a time of rhythmic and cold artistic expression, where the images of the demigods were replaced by the motif of the Prince of Death's half-wheel. The presence of the deathly influence was a steady vibration of the communal spirit, a shallow and rhythmic reminder that everyone, from the lowliest tarnished to the highest noble, was now equal in the eyes of the grave. The propaganda of the eternal queen had faded, replaced by a rhythmic and sharp appreciation for the transient and the mortal. The struggle for the memory of the past moved with a relentless and cold energy as the old records of the cursed undead were rewritten into the hagiography of the blessed Duskborn. The atmosphere of the royal archives turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They encountered the new scriptures, where the rhythmic and heavy thud of the old laws was replaced by the poetic and shallow grace of the liturgy of the roots. Every page turned was a thud that shook the hearts of the historians, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the transition to the new age required the burial of the old truth. The lore shows that by embracing the Deathroot, the world had found a way to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, turning a rhythmic and cold war into a shallow and silver peace. However, the new rites were also a source of absolute and rhythmic mystery. The lore tells of how the living and the dead began to live in a rhythmic and cold proximity that would have been unthinkable under the old Golden Order. The atmosphere of the marketplaces was a heavy pressure of the transition, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the gold. They found that the propaganda of the dreadful death had been replaced by a rhythmic and cold comfort. The air in the heart of the villages was a cold flame as they looked at the skeletal guardians who stood watch alongside the living, realizing that the boundary between the two had become a shallow and rhythmic veil. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was planting seeds in a garden that would only bloom at night. They saw the golden light of the old world shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the new capital, and the air of the past grew distant as they prepared for the journey to the final rest of the prince. The light of the Duskborn was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the peace that had finally become the law of the land. The path toward the final legacy was nearly complete. The transition from the era of fear to the era of the Duskborn was a reality, and the memory of the golden Godwyn was now just the first chapter in the book of the dead. King. Transition from a human-centric culture to a biological metamorphosis of the environment was a shift into a world where nature itself became an extension of the Prince of Death. As the age of the Duskborn matured, the Deathroot did not merely settle, it evolved, weaving itself into the cellular structure of the lands between. The air in the northern reaches and the deep forests became a thick, pressurized weight that smelled of damp moss, cold mineral, and the sharp, alkaline scent of the grave glow. This was the era of the great ecological rebirth. The sound of the wilderness was no longer the rhythmic chirping of birds, but the low, rhythmic hum of the silver-gray flora and the shallow, rhythmic rustle of leaves that felt like cold parchment. The history of the transformed wildlife is a chronicle of a rhythmic and cold adaptation. In the lore of the new wilderness, the creatures that roamed the lands, the bears, the wolves, and even the gargantuan rune bears, began to show signs of the dusk touch. The atmosphere of the Mistuad was a suffocating pressure of absolute and heavy stillness. These animals were not rot-infested or sickly. Rather, their fur grew thick with silver-white strands, and their eyes took on the rhythmic and sharp glow of the prince's own gaze. Every growl was a thud that echoed the new vitality of the soil, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the Deathroot had provided a path for the physical world to persist long after the grace of the Erdtree had faded into a shallow and rhythmic memory. The investigation into the northern peaks reveals a world where the ice and the Deathroot had formed a rhythmic and cold alliance. The traveler moves through the mountaintops of the giants, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the frozen sap. This was a time of monumental and quiet transformation, where the rhythmic and heavy thud of the falling snow was the only marker of time. The colossal skeletons of the giants, once mere landmarks of a dead war, began to be reanimated by the pulse of the roots. Their presence was a steady vibration of the absolute and heavy scale of the new order, their massive bones entwined with black thorns that acted as a rhythmic and sharp nervous system. The struggle for biological dominance moved with a relentless and cold energy as the traditional plants of the Erdtree, the Erdleaf, and the golden centipede were slowly replaced by the dusk bloom and the soul root. The atmosphere of the meadows turned into a thin weight that smelled of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot. They encountered the new migration patterns of the ancestors, every movement a thud that shook the hearts of the surviving naturalists. The lore shows that the Deathroot was acting as a rhythmic and cold conduit for the planet's energy, bypassing the need for the sun's direct light. The air in the heart of the woods was a cold flame as the first death willows began to weep their silver sap, realizing that the transition to the new ecology was a rhythmic and sharp victory for the cycle of the grave. However, the biological shift also created a new kind of rhythmic and cold predator. The lore tells of how the wraith callers and the omen were no longer outcasts, but the rhythmic and sharp apex of the new food chain. The atmosphere of the deep valleys was a heavy pressure of the transition, where the air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the ancient memories of the gold. They found that the propaganda of natural purity was a lie that had been rhythmically and sharply dismantled. The air in the heart of the wilds was a cold flame as they looked at the new balance of the world, realizing that the dusk was a state of being where the predator and the prey were both rhythmic and sharp participants in an eternal, soulless dance. The story moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was watching a forest grow over a ruined city. They saw the golden light of the old world shrinking in the distance of the past. The air, there, a thick and humid pressure that smelled of the deep water and the ancient magic. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark in the heart of the land. They entered the heart of the northern wilderness, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to witness the total integration of the world. The light of the duskborn was a steady and heavy rhythm that filled the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the wild that had finally found its true, rhythmic, and cold nature. The path toward the final conclusion was nearly at its end. The transition from the era of man to the era of the integrated root was complete, and the lands between were now a single, rhythmic, and cold organism. The transition from a world of change to a world of eternal, rhythmic stillness marks the final chapter of the golden lineage. The age of the duskborn has reached its absolute and cold maturity, where the memory of Godwyn the Golden is no longer a story of a fallen prince, but the physical law that governs every grain of sand and every drop of water in the lands between. The air in this final era is a permanent, pressurized weight that smells of silver mist, ancient stone, and the deep, silent scent of a root that has finally stopped growing because it has reached everywhere. This is the ultimate legacy, a world where death is not an ending, but a steady, rhythmic state of being. The history of the final grave is the chronicle of a planet that has found its rhythmic and cold peace. In the lore of the end times, the distinction between the living and the dead has been rhythmically and sharply erased. The atmosphere of the world is a suffocating pressure of a quietude that the greater will could never have imagined. The Erd-tree, now a massive, translucent skeleton of gray bark and black thorns, stands as a rhythmic and sharp monument to the transition. It no longer demands sacrifice or worship. It simply exists as a steady vibration of the absolute and heavy reality that all things are now part of Godwyn. Every pulse of the land is a thud that echoes the silence of the prince, a rhythmic and sharp reminder that the golden era was merely a shallow and rhythmic fever dream before the long sleep. The investigation into the final state of the lands reveals a monumental and rhythmic symmetry. The traveler moves through the silent streets of Lanedell, now a city of silver ash and stone, where the air carries the scent of the cooling rain and the sharp, metallic tang of the eternal twilight. This is a time of absolute and cold perfection, where the rhythmic and heavy thud of the heart has been replaced by the shallow and rhythmic hum of the soul root. The shard-bearers are gone, their ambitions buried under the weight of the new law. Their presence is no longer a steady vibration of power, but a rhythmic and sharp footnote in a history that has reached its final page. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, but in the end, they were all just fertilizer for the prince's dream. The struggle for the meaning of the world has moved with a relentless and cold energy toward a point of absolute and rhythmic zero. The atmosphere of the lands between is a thin weight that smells of the cooling rain and the sharp scent of the soot from a fire that went out an eternity ago. They encountered the final form of life, the Duskborn, a rhythmic and sharp synthesis of flesh and root that does not age, does not hunger, and does not fear. The lore shows that this was the true unalloyed state that Miquella and Marika had searched for, a world where the rhythmic and cold cycle of the grave has provided the only true stability. The air in the heart of the world is a cold flame, realizing that the transition to the dusk was the only way to save the land from the madness of the gods. The story has moved with the steady rhythm of a person who has finally finished a long walk and sat down to watch the stars. They saw the golden light of the past shrinking until it was nothing more than a rhythmic and sharp spark in the distance of a memory. They were the masters of the silent footstep and the heavy steel, and the air around them was a blur of the movement and the sound. They moved with the steady rhythm of a person who was cutting the roots of the hidden dark, only to find that the dark was the only thing that was real. They entered the heart of the eternal night, and the air of the city grew distant as they prepared for the journey to simply be. The light of the Duskborn is a steady and heavy rhythm that fills the silent spaces of the mind, a guide through the silence that is the only truth left. The path of the Godwyn legacy has reached its end. The transition from the Golden Prince to the foundation of the world is complete, and the lands between are finally, rhythmically, and sharply at rest.